And Dave represents Minnesota on the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Coordinating Committee. Good morning to you, Dave. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate that. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be with you and to hear from the other states too. In Illinois and Minnesota, we don't have everything figured out here on how to do all this. There's some very large reduction needs, and we've been at this for a while, and yet we need to continue to learn from our successes and failures in Minnesota, but also from what's going on in other states such as Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, and others. So yeah, good to be with you here today, and we'll just share a little bit about what we're doing in Minnesota, how we're tracking some progress, and some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we're seeing too. As we look at our nutrient reduction strategy in Minnesota, it was finalized in 2014 by 11 organizations. And I do want to make the point, Matt made the point very well that there's been a lot of work going on before these nutrient reduction strategies in our states. And in conservation and agriculture, been going on for decades. Our wastewater treatment really started reducing phosphorus in about 2004. So, in stormwater, other feedlot program, other programs. So we've really done a lot and prior to 2014 that won't always be reflected in each of these slides. But what our nutrient reduction strategy does is brings together all these different efforts and programs that were just kind of ramping up and starting, recommendations for new types of efforts, how we're going to track, how we're going to monitor, and kind of pulls it all together into one document. As we look at kind of a big picture overview of our strategy, similar to Iowa's logic model, where they have inputs on the left, we have large scale program advances, we call it, and this can be private industry and or government. And many of those get implemented at the local watersheds, and that's where the human dimension is really critical, and the people and what's going to work locally. And so many of our programs get funneled through the local watershed approach, but not all of them. Some go directly to the land and our changes in our rural and urban lands. And with those changes on our land, we intend to see changes in our water, both locally and then downstream. So we just completed in August a 5-year progress report in Minnesota. And this looks back primarily on the progress from about 2014-15 and 5 years after that. And it's all documented on our website now. There's a number of appendices that get into more details on, for example, river nutrient trends, or different state programs that we have, with providing links to really everything I'll be talking about here. So today I want to just kind of go through each of these blocks, talk about the progress in our large scale program advances, then move to our progress with our watershed approach, then on to changes in the rural and urban lands, and then our progress with what we're seeing in terms of trends in our waters. I'm going to start with a slide here of showing spending and how that's changed over the years since 2004. And the federal sources in orange and state sources in blue. And you can see right around 2010, we started in that blue shade, really started increasing our state funding of practices and support for those practices. And so now we're over $80 million per year for those. And that all stemmed from a constitutional amendment that increased our sales taxes, or Clean Water Fund, and has been providing tremendous support for much of our efforts in Minnesota. We have in our progress report documented over 30 program advances. And these program advances, some of them are education, outreach, and research. Some of them are voluntary program advances. Others are regulatory program advances. Others are watershed related. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them there, the ones in green, recognizing that this fits in a body of a bunch of different program advancements that are all documented. in that heard a bunch of noise. If someone could mute.
Let me see if I can find it.
Thank you. So all of this is documented in our nutrient reduction strategy progress report and on our website there at the bottom. So let's talk about a few of these individual programs. One of the key ones in Minnesota is Minnesota's Agricultural Water Quality Certification Program, led by our Department of Agriculture in partnership with other government agencies, the private sector industry, producers. And it's a program that provides 10 years of regulatory certainty, so some predictability. If you get into it, there's not going to be new laws passed that'll change what you necessarily need to do, especially at the state level anyway. The priority dollars for new practices are given if they're certified. So if they're certified to get some additional money and priority for cost share. There's community recognition, and there's been really a growth in this since 2015, over 900 farms, 600,000 acres, and over 1,800 new practices. And it's a pretty high bar. In order to get certified, they have to, it's a very thorough assessment in what's going on in the farm in order to get someone certified. Another key program in Minnesota, we know we're going to have to rely on our living cover practices. We're not going to achieve our goals without them, without cover crops, relay crops, perennials. We can make a lot of progress without them, but this is key for our long-term goals. And so our University of Minnesota, working with many others, is developing these new cropping systems for continuous living cover. But it doesn't just stop at the developing of the crops and the plant breeding, but goes all the way through working with our food science people and supply chain development and market development. And so there's several promising crops, perennials, and cover crops that are being looked at right now. Another recent change in Minnesota is there's a nitrogen fertilizer, well, it's called a groundwater protection rule, but it's really all about nitrogen fertilizer in our more vulnerable groundwater areas. And so fall nitrogen fertilizer is restricted starting this year. It was adopted in 2019, starting this year. So this pertains to those purple areas there. There's a total of 2.6 million acres where it could potentially apply. Many of those lands did not have fall nitrogen fertilizer to begin with, so the net effect isn't going to be that high in terms of acres. But there's a second part of the rule too, and this deals with wellhead protection areas primarily, but also can go beyond that. And it's where BMPs can phase from voluntary to regulatory, depending on the nitrate levels and the trends in those nitrate levels and the BMP adoption rates. Now, this would apply to fewer acres, but it would affect a lot of well water. And what we learn from dealing with these wellhead areas, we can apply to other areas as well. So we'll learn a lot through this. But those red dots are where we've got vulnerable wells and elevated nitrate. I was asked also to mention Minnesota's buffer law. And this didn't really stem from the nutrient reduction strategy, but it was coming into play at about the same time our nutrient reduction strategy was completed. And so we certainly recognize buffers, riparian buffers, as one of many BMPs that can help with particularly phosphorus, to some degree nitrate, of course, sediment. So there's 50-foot requirements for rivers, lakes, and streams, and 16.5-foot requirements for public ditches. And I should point out too, though, that many people already had the buffers in place. So we really were at about 70 to 80% compliance before the law went into effect. The law allows for alternatives that provide equal protection, alternative practices or combination of practices, and provided financial support. And you can see the progress from January 2017 through January 2020 in terms of the compliance. As we go from lighter shades to darker shades, it's a higher compliance. And right now, our Board of Water and Soil Resources, who manages this program, estimates that we have 99% compliance with this law right now. Wastewater permitting has made progress, but this progress again didn't begin in 2014. Really, it started in around 2000 when we had a 1 milligram per liter effluent performance standard for new and expanded plants. But then we added in other drivers of lake eutrophication standards and wastewater rules and river eutrophication standards in our nutrient strategy. So we've had a big drop in primarily in the Mississippi River Basin in our phosphorus coming from wastewater entering directly into rivers and streams. For nitrogen, though, we don't see that same sort of success. We haven't been working too hard at reducing nitrogen, total nitrogen anyway, or nitrate nitrogen from our wastewater systems. But one of the things we have done since 2014, and it was part of our nutrient reduction strategy, was to monitor so we could get a much better handle on what's coming out, what's going in, what's coming out of our wastewater treatment plants. And so we've done a good job of that. And right now we're trying to look at optimizing nitrogen treatment while not compromising our phosphorus progress that we've made. And then we have a multi-step plan here to move forward and achieve nitrogen reductions from wastewater treatment. So that's all I was going to mention on our large-scale program advances, and then now move into our local watershed approach, which is key in Minnesota. And really what our watershed approach focuses more on our local waters within our watersheds, but it also brings in the element of what do we need to do for downstream needs. So it's really a combination of aiming to meet both local and downstream needs. We have watershed load reduction targets that would collectively achieve our downstream load reduction goals. And these are based on kind of a fair share approach, looking at how much of our nutrients is coming from anthropogenic sources, how much is reducible, and how much is net more coming from natural lands. And it also takes into account attenuation as the rivers move on downstream. But anyway, which provides these load and percentage reductions for meeting our milestone interim goals as well as our final goals. Minnesota's watershed approach really works at multiple scales. So in the previous slides, we were showing the Huck 8 level watersheds, which is the same as we have on the left side here. And in these watersheds, we're blanketing the whole state one by one with these watersheds, where we're taking a close look at the science, the monitoring, the modeling, the sources, land uses, not just for nutrients, but other impairments too, whether they be bacteria or sediment or other parameters. And so our watershed science is informing our local planning across the state. And we also realize that we need these focused watersheds. We can't show progress as well with the bigger watersheds, but if we can target smaller watersheds where we really have concerted long-term efforts, such as what's being funded through Section 319 in our small watershed projects, then we can start to really show locally some success stories and then replicate those elsewhere. And then to the right, another important part of our work in Minnesota, as it is with many states, is our farm and field scale implementation and monitoring, trying to where we get right down to where we can really see cause and effect in our discovery farms and other farms and small scale efforts where we're making changes to the land, but also doing intensive monitoring of what's happening in the water. Our nutrient reduction strategy in Minnesota really emphasized the importance of private industry. We knew government alone wasn't going to solve these problems. And so partnerships, though, are really important. And we've got a number of new partnerships. We need more of them, but we do have some that are really showing promise when we take local watersheds and have private industry working with local government, working with nonprofit organizations and others, to landowners, to really figure out the best way for their area to make changes that will result in improvement in our water. So that's just a little bit about our local watershed approach. I'll move on to changes in our rural and urban lands. What are we seeing in terms of progress on our lands? And so how do we tell if practices are being adopted in the first place? Something I think all our states, and Matt has worked quite a bit on this in Iowa, and we're trying to learn from them as well. But I break this out into three sorts of categories. And adoption through government support programs is one thing that we can track and keep, and we've made pretty good progress on that in terms of developing systems for understanding BMP adoption through our government programs. And B, there's these other indicators of broader overall adoption, the U.S. Census of Agriculture, surveys, NAS surveys, satellite imagery, sales information. There's a variety of ways that we're looking at to see what that's telling us. And then permitting, sometimes we get some additional information, particularly from point sources on permitting, but also even our feedlots and manure spreading. We do a fair amount of inspections on land application throughout the state. So let me start with the adoption through government programs. And we have a new tracking system for state and federal programs that brings together the BMPs being adopted each year, the new BMPs added each year from federal and state programs. And then we aggregate those BMPs and try to make acreage equivalents, but we aggregate them to 4 scales: the subwatershed, or the Huck 12 level, major watershed, the Huck 8s, our major drainage basins, like all the drainage down the Mississippi or up the Red River to Lake Winnipeg, and then statewide. So this slide just depicts the numbers of practices in terms of BMP counts in different watersheds throughout the state. And when we go to our Healthier Watersheds website, listed at the bottom, we can click on any watershed, and then it'll show how much progress we're making in every sub-watershed within that bigger watershed. For our nutrient reduction strategy, we wanted to be able to aggregate this to our major drainage ways. And you can see Minnesota, really the headwaters of three drainages to Lake Winnipeg, to the north, to the Great Lakes and Lake Superior, into the Gulf of Mexico. And so we aggregate and categorize, and we can look at categories of BMPs such as living cover, cropland erosion control, drainage water retention and treatment, and nutrient management. And this is through our government programs again. Or we can break it apart and look at more specific BMPs and specific funding agencies and programs for these BMPs. So for example, this shows the living cover BMPs, and kind of the teal color there is cover crop, and that's the largest one throughout the past decade. And we've made some progress with cover crops. This isn't cumulative, but showing each year how many new acres are added into being supported through these government programs. And we have seen a ramp up of cover crops. And we need to also evaluate this in terms of our overall goals. So we had put together scenarios, BMP adoption scenarios, that would allow us to achieve our milestone targets in 2025 and our final goals in 2040. And so we had a combination of practices and identified the acres that we would need. It was a kind of an expert group brought together at the University of Minnesota, included many others, to develop what's the best combination of practices that we could use to work toward focusing mostly on our interim target initially, And you can see the red dot there. We're starting to increase, but we need really to increase our cover crops exponentially to get to our final goals. So if we combine all of our government program BMPs and compare them to what we have in our nutrient reduction strategy milestone scenario, you can see that we got a ways to go. So the darker blue shows kind of where we add up in 5 different categories of BMPs: fertilizer use efficiencies, field erosion control, cover crops, perennials, and drainage water retention and treatment. So to get to our milestone targets, that's the acres in the boxes above indicate those acres in combination would allow us to achieve our both our phosphorus and our 20% nitrogen milestone target. And this does not include the private industry and private adoption. So of course, with fertilizer use efficiencies, so much of that happens, majority of that really happens outside of the government programs. And so we also need ways we can evaluate these by other means, looking at the overall adoption. So we have a variety of ways that we're looking at that. Our Board of Water and Soil Resources, our University of Minnesota, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Department of Ag, others. And so we have all this documented in our progress report and kind of what each of these types of things are telling us. And without getting into the details of each one, just to note that when we look at everything in combination, all of our indicators and our government program tracking, our other broader indicators in our permitting, reporting, inspections, it very clearly is showing that in combination, we're falling well short of our nutrient strategy BMP scenarios. The scale of adoption needs are so big, even to get a 20% reduction. We are making progress. I think that's the good news. We can show progress in different areas, but it's not at the scale that we have identified in our nutrient reduction strategy. So what are we seeing in the water as we go to this 4th block, changes in water? If we look at the last decade, we can see that nitrate is increasing or there's no significant trend. So on the left side, we see a lot of red arrows up, which indicates a statistically significant increase at the 0.1 significance level. We also see a lot of gray squares, which is no significant trend. If we go to total phosphorus, we see that it's the opposite. It's either decreasing or no significant trend. So again, showing we've made some progress with phosphorus, wastewater. We can attribute that about 3/4 of that to the wastewater reductions and statewide, and the rest to agricultural improvements as well as stormwater. We have a lawn fertilizer requirement, feedlot progress, and other areas. If we go over the past 20 years, we see very similar trends. We see a lot of decreasing trends for phosphorus, 21, 6 no trends and 1 increase up at the border of Canada there. And for nitrate, very similar, although we do bring in a couple of decreases that we can't totally explain, but relatively small in the range of around 15 to 20%, but predominantly increases or no trend detected. Our annual precipitation has been increasing in Minnesota, as it has many other parts of the country, and especially in southern Minnesota. So this is really challenging, especially to try and keep those. While we have phosphorus concentration decreases shown on the previous slides, of course our loads are driven by concentration and flow, and as our river flows increase, that's offsetting many of our other gains that we've had, particularly with phosphorus, and making it more difficult with nitrogen. If we look at the Mississippi River at Red Wing, which you can see in the upper left, kind of the watershed that encompasses, our nitrate loads really have been increasing since the late 1990s. Combination concentrations are increasing, precip is increasing, so the loads are increasing. And with phosphorus at that site, our loads have while their concentrations have come down, overall we're seeing an up and down with the loads, and that driven again partly by the rainfall and the increasing rains. So I'll wrap this up and take some questions. That our 5-year progress report was recently completed. It's online. We've advanced 30 large-scale programs affecting nutrients. We have found that agricultural BMP adoption is not keeping pace with scenarios outlined in our strategy. Wastewater, over a 70% reduction of phosphorus, and nitrogen, while we've made good progress on monitoring, our next steps are to work harder at getting reductions from our wastewater nitrogen. River phosphorus concentrations have decreased on 20 to 50% over the last 20 years, but the higher river flows are offsetting our load reductions that we'd otherwise expect. River nitrogen concentrations and loads have been increasing by over 25% in the past 20 years. We have a state water plan that really combines nutrient and climate practices and to reduce and mitigate the effects of climate change. Many of the practices that we have in our nutrient reduction strategy have multiple benefits, as I'm sure your states as well. And so really one of the emphases moving forward is to not just look at nitrate and strategies for nitrogen, not just strategies for phosphorus. How can we use these practices to get resiliency for the climate change? How can we have more wildlife habitat, have better soil health, and agricultural productivity, along with nutrient and sediment reductions in our water. So this multiple benefits concept is something that we're really going to be looking at, and many of the practices that are in this new 2020 state water plan will be also a part of nutrient reduction and how we want to move forward with nutrient reduction. We're going to update our strategy. The plan is in 2025, and but keep looking at ways we can do better up until then. So that's all I had, other than I just want to point out our website, and it goes right here to our nutrient reduction strategy. There's quite a bit of information on here, including our 5-year progress report and all the reports there, and our tracking BMP progress site, our system that we have for that, which and you can click on that, and it shows the progress that we're making, and collectively in these different categories of practices, but also we can look at any period of time and look at the trends in other categories and specific practices in Minnesota. All right, with that, I'll stop sharing, and
Dave, thank you. We appreciate that. We do have some follow-up questions. I think actually on that last page that you had up from the website, we'll start with that, relatively speaking. Somebody'd like to know on those BMPs, especially things like EQIP and CSP, which are typically on 5-year or less federally funded contracts. Is there a way that you're able to track them after those contracts have expired?
Yeah, that is something we've been wrestling with, because recognizing that not everyone who signs up and runs it for 3 years or so is going to continue, and we thought a 5-year window was a pretty reasonable window to look at. But the further you look out, you're going to realize that some of those acreages are going to drop off, and so that's why we really have to look at this in a combination of ways, and looking at some of those broader indicators. Satellite imagery, census surveys, other surveys, to really help us evaluate what's going on, what's the net effect of all this across the landscape. And so the government program tracking gives us one kind of certain indicators. Other types of tracking give us other indicators. You have to put it all together. It still doesn't paint a real clear picture, but at least gives you some notion of what's going on out there, and the progress that's being made.
Following up on that, what from the beginning of your presentation, what are the approved alternatives for the buffers that you talked about that are required by legislation? And also, they'd like to know how hard that was actually to get through the Minnesota legislature.
Yeah, that was happening through our Board of Water and Soil Resources and our governor's office, and it was really a governor's initiative to have this buffer law. There wasn't, I think we've heard a lot of complaints about how that was pushed through, and over time, I think producers have generally come to see that there are alternatives. There is funding. It wasn't um, maybe quite as onerous as they might have initially anticipated, but nonetheless, yeah, it wasn't well received across the whole state, that's for sure. And there are alternatives. There was a task force that was put together by our Board of Water and Soil Resources that looked at what could be considered as alternatives. So anything that would provide, if you take take a look at other types of practices. For example, if you went closer than 50 feet in some areas, you could have an average 50-foot reduction, and that would qualify. If you had a combination of cover crops leading up to that and could show that was going to provide equivalent protection, that would work. And in terms of reducing nutrients and sediment going into the waters. Of course, there's other benefits of buffers too, but yeah, that's all laid out in our the website. There's a good website for this, and that is included. That website is included in our state level program advances appendix A to our 5-year progress report, found at that website, that same website I just went into, and that'll show you more details on what the alternatives were allowed and how that all works.
We have some longer term questions for you. Unlike Illinois and Iowa, Minnesota, and you can confirm this for me, appears to be experiencing some conversion of land to crops. How does that impact your approach on reducing the nutrient loads? I, and what are you working with on that? And then, well, uh, have you discussed strategies for ramping up the implementation rates that is needed in Minnesota to meet your goals? So the two things I think run as a twin uh, purposes, because if you're getting more property that is now farmland and having nutrients applied, you might really have to ramp things up.
Yeah, we have in Appendix B of our 5-year progress report, we talk about the external factors that are changing, and including some of the ones that you mentioned. Tile drainage is another one that has really increased in recent years. So yeah, but when we develop these strategies, yeah, we're going to have these changes, and those are documented. We look at those, but it's not a game changer. These aren't such dramatic changes that it really changes the nature of our strategy. So we set a strategy in 2014. We're tracking some of these external factors. When we revise the strategy and update it in 2025, definitely those sorts of land use changes and other changes and climate changes will have to be considered and come into play. But we're not adjusting it every year. It's not a type of strategy where we need to account for these changes year by year by year. It's more of a, we're going to look at it every decade. Okay, what's been happening, and then how do we need to adjust? So when we revise this in 2025, I'm sure all that will be carefully considered.
Here's we'll continue in the adjustment fact, and I think I may need some clarification on the question itself. Did Minnesota consider normalizing their P and N discharges from rivers relative to the annual rainfall to see if the nutrient discharge increases changed at a greater rate than the fractional rainfall increase? I'm thinking, but I'm not certain, that this may have to do with the rainfalls coming in larger events. Is that correct? And whether that causes a change.
Mm-hmm.
in P and N discharges?
Yeah, yeah, I'll address that. In terms of our trends analyses, we used flow adjusted or flow normalization approaches, as well as approaches that did not consider flow normalization. And when we look at the concentrations, it did affect things somewhat when we normalize for flow, and which is in effect taken into account these rainfall changes too. We did see some differences, but the overall pattern was very similar in terms of nitrate and phosphorus. We did see fewer significant trends when we did not normalize for flow. When we look at loads, you know, that also made a difference. If we normalize for the flow, we see more significant trends. Those decreases with phosphorus, those increases with nitrate, and when we don't, we're less able to detect the trends. So yeah, we did take a look at that. That's all described in detail in Appendix C of our progress report.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here, John.